104 in Surah An-Nisa. And this verse, alhamdulillah, is a verse that speaks about the idea of hope, rija. And the concept of hope in Islam is a very beautiful one. You have many verses in the Quran that speak about the idea of hope. You also have many of the Prophet, the Anbiya, speak about hope and not despairing in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such as Yaqub, who we'll speak about in a little bit. And the verse first recites in English, "Do not be faint of heart in pursuing the enemy. If you are suffering hardship, so are they, but you hope to receive something from God for which they cannot hope. God is all-knowing and all-wise." So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse says, وَلَا تَهِنُوا فِي ابْتِغَاءِ الْقَوْمِ. And here the Mufassirin, they say this verse was revealed in the Battle of Uhud. So you know the Battle of Uhud, the Muslim community was in a sense of pain. And this is one of the beautiful aspects of the Quran, is that the Quran doesn't only speak about the goodness, doesn't only speak about Jannah and paradise, but it speaks about feelings and emotions that cause people grief. You have ideas of huzn, of gham, of sadness, of despair, of pain. And here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to the believers that on the day of Uhud, they felt this sense of pain, this idea of gham, of sadness, that they felt this idea that they had lost the war. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن تَكُونُوا تَأْلَمُونَ فَإِنَّهُمْ يَأْلَمُونَ كَمَا تَأْلَمُونَ. So you think that you are in a sense of pain, but realize that the enemy is also in a sense of pain. So many times when you're fighting in a battle or in a competition, you begin to feel sad about your losses. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding the believers that the people who are proud and arrogant and feel like they've won, they have losses as well. They're in a sense of pain. And sometimes you look at the enemy and they look so strong and insurmountable. No one can defeat them. But really they're on the verge of collapse. As we see in many revolutions in the Muslim world, that it looks like a stable regime. It looks like that no one can take them down. They look like they have all the power in the world, but in a minute it's gone. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to the believers, yes, there is pain in the loss, but realize that your enemy, they have pain, just like you have pain. Then the verse continues and talks about this very beautiful concept in the Quran of rija, of hope. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَتَرْجُونَ مِنَ اللَّهِ مَا لَا يَرْجَعُونَ. SubhanAllah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here that you are different than them. So both of you are in pain. You had a battle. Some people, you lost, they lost. Both of you are in pain. But there's something that distinguishes you from the disbeliever. What is that? Rija, the hope. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they don't have any hope. And this reminds us of the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where Abu Sufyan, he was very happy after the Battle of Uhud. And he said to the believers, he said to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, Yawma lak wa yawma alayk. He said, there is one day for you and one day against you. So he was referring to Battle of Badr. That Battle of Badr we lost, but in Uhud we won. And then Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he heard this and he told Umar and said, no, tell them that your dead are in the hellfire. قَتْلَاكُمْ فِي النَّارِ وَقَتْلَانَا فِي الْجَنَّةِ. And our people who died are in Jannah. So it's not equal. Don't think now you won and everything, you're victorious. Yes, some people pass away, like Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but they didn't lose. Rather, they were a shaheed, they were a martyr, a witness. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here very beautifully that you have something that these disbelievers do not have. And that is the idea of the hope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The hope in this life that we see after Uhud, there was Hudaybiyah, there was Fath al-Makkah, and you have hope after you die, subhanAllah. And this is something that makes us, the believer, different than the disbeliever. Because the majority of the disbelievers, the people who don't have iman, they believe that this life is it. After this life is gone, nothing will happen. But we as Muslims, we believe that we have the hope in meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of standing with the sabiqeen, of going to Jannah, that drinking from the hand of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, going to Jannah al-Firdaus. This is part of the hope we have in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all knowledgeable and all wise. When I was researching this verse, I was looking at all the examples of rija in the Quran. And rija is an amazing concept because in the Quran and in Islam, rija is tied to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and is tied to action. So there's a difference between rija and tamanni. Rija in Islam is that you actually work for it, where tamanni is that you are lazy and you hope and wish for something that never happens. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, you find the most beautiful example. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُ اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. Subhanallah. That whoever wants and hopes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Day of Judgment, then follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Because he was a hopeful person, not overly pessimistic and in despair. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in another verse connects this idea of rija to amal al-salihat. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَالَّذِينَ هَاجَرُوا وَجَاهَدُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أُولَٰئِكَ يَرْجُونَ رَحْمَةَ اللَّهِ. Subhanallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those who believe and act, what do? They do hijrah, they migrate. Like many of you came to this country looking for a better life. وَجَاهَدُوا, and they strive in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then what? These are the people that hope for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to conclude, we see this in the stories of the Anbiya, of the prophets. That the prophets, they have this idea of hope. That they're sometimes in very difficult circumstances. But they always turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they say, Ya Allah, ufawwidu amri ila Allah. I rely upon you. So we see this beautifully in Yaqub alayhi salam. Amazing father, someone's emotional, cares about his children. He cries. He longs for Yusuf and Benjamin. And in the story in the beginning, as you all know, he loses his son. That's one of the hardest things for any parent, to lose a child and not know where they are. You don't know, are they well? Are they sick? Did they die? Are they living? And then he loses a second son later on, Benjamin. Benjamin is taken in Egypt. And Yaqub alayhi salam is in a state of despair. He's, what should I do now? So when his sons come back for the second time and tell him, we lost the son, we lost one of your sons, what does he say? فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ. Subhanallah, Allahu Akbar. He says, a beautiful patient. I'll be not just patient, jameen. I will do it in a beautiful way. I'm not going to become depressed and despair and just lock myself in my room. No, I'm going to continue to be a worshiper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he continues, عَسَى اللَّهُ أَن يَأْتِيَنِي بِهِمْ جَمِيعًا. Allahu Akbar. He said, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring both of them back to me. SubhanAllah. He still remembers Yusuf. Most people will forgot. Now I was, SubhanAllah, reading some of the news coming out of Bangladesh. There are people in secret prisons. They came out after years. People didn't even know that they were still alive. But when you interview the families, they said, I still had a hope. I was still hoping that they would be alive and they would come out. And then when he sends his sons back to Egypt, back to Yusuf alayhi salam, he gives them advice. This is so beautiful. Because sometimes us as parents, we just want our kids to look nice and get good grades, and then also make sure that we provide for them. But Yaqub alayhi salam, he's a mu'allim, he's a teacher. He gives his children spiritual advice. What does he say to them? He says, فَتَحَسَّسُوا مِنْ Yusuf. Look for Yusuf wa akhi and Benjamin. وَلَا تَيْأَسُوا مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ. Allahu Akbar. And he says, don't despair in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Never despair. And then he makes this remarkable statement, إِنَّهُ لَا يَيْأَسُ مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. Subhanallah. He says the only people who despair in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the disbelievers. So we have something in Islam called mafhum and mukhalafa. So you understand something from its opposite. So if the disbelievers are the one that despairs, what are the believers? The believers are the one that have hope. So a definition of a mu'min is someone who has iman. Literally someone who implements iman. But what does it mean to implement iman? It means to have hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The hope in goodness in this life, goodness in the hereafter, and goodness for all people who do good and are righteous. So brothers and sisters in Islam, to conclude, we see this verse is so beautiful because it distinguishes what is different between the believer and the disbeliever. And the believer is someone who has iman. But what is iman? Iman is that you look today, Fajr, we woke up in the salah, and we have hope that this day would be good. That this day will be better than the day before. That we are not in the sense of always pessimism, that something is going to bad is going to happen. Yes, we're realistic. Yes, we fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we want good in this life and the hereafter. And we see that in these verses, we see the idea of genuine hope. Because there's a false hope. And here the ulama, they say that someone who just focuses on hope, they could be led to sin, ma'asi. Why? Because if you just think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and mercy and tawbah, then you say, I'll go ahead and sin because Allah will forgive me. No, there's this idea of khawf, that you fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this idea is that you have to act in a good way. You cannot just simply do whatever you want and then rely on the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the idea of genuine hope is إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Yes, we believe, yes, we have hope, but we also act in a righteous manner. And this is so important for us as individual believers, as well as a community, that we live in trying times, what we're seeing going on in Gaza, with the Rohingyas, Kashmir, Sudan. It's a very difficult time, and it's easy for us to fall in the state of despair, that nothing will come good. But we see also in other places, whether that's in Bangladesh, other areas in the Muslim world, that there are opportunities for change and renewal. And we always have to have this idea and this belief, as Yaqub alayhi salam, لا تيأسوا من روح الله, that we should never despair in the power and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That He has the ability to give us good here and now, but also when we meet Him on Yawm al-Qiyamah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا